Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello everybody, my name is Debbie from NDIS Property Australia, and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that explains, highlights, guides and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. I've got Denise from our feasibility team with us today. Hi Denise.
Hi Debbie.
Good to have you here. What are we going to be talking about today?
Well, we recently did a whole research report on our top 30 potential hotspot suburbs for SDA within Australia. And yeah, we'll get that.
Yeah, so we thought it would be good to not tell you what the top 30 are, obviously. If you want that information, you're going to have to ask for a report. But it was a very interesting process because we hadn't done anything like this before. The brief basically was to determine the top 30 locations for SDA development around Australia and in areas where the property costs were below around $1.5 million as a guideline. So basically that did mean we had to exclude a number of locations that would have come in at the top 30, such as parts of Sydney, the northern suburbs, northern beaches, eastern suburbs, inner east, where property prices are far more expensive. But we still were able to find a lot of really good locations that did meet that criteria for our clients. So, Denise, do you want to just maybe start with how we began the process?
Right, so we currently have an over-under report for each state and SA4s. So we look at all of the SA4s in every single state within Australia based on our over-under report, which you can find on our website. And the over-under report doesn't just look at the current supply, demand versus supply, but at the potential projection pipelines as well. So from there, we look at all the potential SA4s that are more undersupplied.
So they've got like a short-term and a long-term undersupply, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the issue, of course, with that is that an SA4 is a really large area. It covers a population of anywhere between 100 and 500,000 people. So it's a good place to start, but it had a lot of, obviously, issues there. So what do we do next?
From there, we narrow down to the SA3 level, which, do you want to explain what SA3 is?
Yes, so an SA3 region has a population of between 30 and 130,000. And any SA4 could have anywhere from 3 to 10 or more different SA3s within it. And those SA3s can vary hugely in geography, demographics, populations. So some might be oversupplied and others and undersupplied. But when you look at the overall SA4 numbers, it might not give a very clear picture. A good example, and this was not an area that we did put into our report because it is so oversupplied, is Melbourne West SA4 has the largest SA4 oversupply in Australia. But within Melbourne West, there are 5 SA3s, and they range all the way to the inner western suburbs of Melbourne, like Footscray. And so some of those SA3s actually have a much lower supply of SDA. So we really had to look at individual SA3s as well. But again, that is a large population base, so it doesn't narrow it down to specific locations. So that's when it got interesting, wasn't it, Denise?
Yeah, it really was. But moving forward on the SA3 level, we start by looking at the demand, right? We look at the NDIS versus SDA participants and how many of those SDA-funded participants are not yet housed in SDAs. And then we proceed to the supply, which generally people will look at the dwellings, but we were focusing on the number of places within each dwellings.
So that would give us an exact correlation between the number of participants versus the number of places.
Right, exactly. More specifically, we were looking at the ratio of 1 to 3 resident places versus 4 resident or more group homes.
Group homes, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We do also take into account the pipeline supply, but that is only limited to the SA4 region, which does not really help too much, but it gives an indication still.
It does, and I think it's our greatest bugbear when we're doing any of our data analysis, isn't it, Denise, is we don't know where that pipeline is in a more specific, we just don't have those specific details unless we know what's happening on the ground from providers, from builders, council data, but even that is not perfect. So from there, where did we go?
Well, from there, we were determining the highest potential SA3s where they're very undersupplied. And we're also looking at the pipeline under versus oversupply. If the total number of 1 to 3 resident versus the pipeline places are overwhelming, then we just completely exclude that from the equation. But essentially then from there we narrow down to the SA2, the suburb level.
Yeah. Now the suburb level of SA2 is great because it really does narrow it down. They've got populations at the SA2 level of between 3 and 25,000 participants. Sorry, 3 and 25,000 people. But the NDIS doesn't provide any SDA data at this level. However, we can get some NDIS data, can't we?
Yes, we can. Debbie managed to find the number of NDIS participants and their the average NDIS annual spending from some websites.
Yeah. So that was when we sort of really narrowed it down to the SA2s, and we looked at the average number of SDA participants that might be there, extrapolated from the larger SA3 percentages. We looked at the number of providers in the area, and as you said, the average NDIS funding per participant in the area. And of course, we looked at the suburb median property prices. That still gave us a huge number of areas to kind of shortlist. So we also looked at other characteristics of each suburb, such as
we tried to focus on the suburbs that fulfill certain requirements, right? First of all, as you said, stick within our client's budget, looking at suburb medium using some of our own softwares. And we try to make sure to see, we're looking to see if they are in certain flood zone areas as well, like flood-prone areas, because they could be more towards the coastline and so on, especially.
Yeah, because we know there's a lot of demand in northern New South Wales, and a lot of those areas are flood-prone.
Exactly.
So that can really limit the available land in an area, making it more difficult.
Yeah.
But we also looked at things like population, shopping, health facilities, transport, terrain, block sizes. So all of those sort of things that an obvious location aspects for any SDA.
Another thing we were looking at were the number of tenanted versus vacant SDAs.
We did?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that brought us to a point where we came up with something like 150, 160 potentially good locations. And when I say a location, it might be a suburb or a combined suburb or a small town or something. And it was like, well, what do we do? How do we shortlist now? So what we did, each member of the feasibility team went through that 150 and shortlisted their own 30. And then we basically compared those to come up with the top, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Yeah. So, look, it wasn't a definitive list of what is the absolute best top locations. Obviously, there were variables we had to exclude a number, and there might have been other issues on the ground or things on the ground that we weren't aware of. But I think it came back with a really good indication of some very good localities for SDA. So, Denise, what were your overall thoughts of the process that we went through?
It was a lot of work, like a lot. It took our team of 4 or 5 months, maybe 2 months, was it?
Yeah, I think it probably did, yeah.
To work that out.
Yeah.
But It was rewarding.
I think it was a very rewarding and a very worthwhile exercise. Thank you to our clients who ordered this report. It's given us a lot more clarity, actually, on the situation in the SDA supply and demand world at the moment. From a countrywide perspective, we do tend to focus on certain areas. And obviously, we're very familiar with areas where we have projects or we're working with specific clients who have projects that they're undertaking. But yeah, there were definitely some surprises, I think, in there that we hadn't realised, and just the clarity it gave on certain areas. And we excluded whole states, didn't we? We didn't include anything in South Australia or the Northern Territory.
Yeah.
Just because they might have, I think the Northern Territory really is a sort of a, there was a small demand a couple of years ago, but it's been well and truly supplied. And at the moment, it's probably not a good location. South Australia still has some good areas, but they're minimal. And they didn't make the top 30 cut, essentially. So, and there weren't a lot of locations in Perth or in Tasmania or in Queensland, but there were still a few. Majority of locations were obviously in Victoria and New South Wales, which we know has the greatest demand. But I want to commend the research team for what they put together here. It was a big job, and just a little insight for our listeners into what goes on in the background in our research and feasibility team and some of the fantastic work that they do. So thank you, Denise, and thank you to the whole research team for their wonderful input into this. And I'm sure we will have future episodes on other aspects of research and feasibility that we're always undertaking. So any last words you wanted to add?
Not really.
Okay, great. That sounds then. All right, well, that's it for this week. But thank you, Denise, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you, Debbie.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.